Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one, we see the Russian Kursk counteroffensive continues at the same time as the offensive operations continue in the east, with the main push taking place in the direction of Pokrovsk in the south. Starting out in the Kursk direction, the Russians have expanded their counter-offensive operations, pushing in the direction of and capturing the village of Ubuhovka and towards Pokrovsk, which they have managed to gain a foothold within. This leads to the village turning into a gray zone. The Russians are, in combination with this, expanding their operational control over the areas northeast of Snagost, where originally they pushed to expand their control over the road between Koronevo and Snagost, but then has launched additional offensive operations into the forest lines, where we see this footage here and the geolocation of it, of a Russian armored personnel carrier sending troops to the front line, dropping them up in the forest lines. So we see that the Russians are continuing their usual offensive strategies. They're just doing it at a faster pace due to the lack of Ukrainian defenses. There is one major difference between the current situation in the Kursk region compared to any of the other recaptures done by Ukraine throughout this war. Usually when Ukraine recaptures an area, such as the Kharkiv and Kherson directions, where they made the most progress, but also in the Zaporizhzhia, Vermivsk directions, and in the Bakhmut direction, there were a lot of fortified positions to take control of, to defend in the Ukraine summer offensive of 2023, which led to them being able to hold on to the territory that they captured. In the fall of 2022, the territory they captured was at a point where the Russian army was too weak to hold on to the territory that they were holding on to. This led to the fact that after the Ukrainian offensive, the Russians simply did not have the necessary strength to launch a counterattack. The situation is completely different now. The Ukrainian attack into Kursk and incursion thereof managed to capture about 800-900 square kilometers of territory. However, the majority of this was not fortified, and at the same time, the Russians had enough units to send reinforcements there without it affecting the other sections of the front line within the war in Ukraine and within Ukrainian territory itself. This means that the Russians had enough forces to launch a counterattack, which they now have, and the Ukrainians were not in fortified positions which they could defend well. This means that they had to build new ones, and building something in a couple of weeks is not enough to deal with such operations. The Ukrainians have barely mined based on the footage we see, and they have not really dug in that well either in the frontline positions which the Russians are now fighting over. This means that the Ukrainians will be forced to withdraw to fortified positions that they have built further back, and it would significantly limit the offensive capabilities of the Ukrainians in the Kursk region. We see that with the fact that the Russians have recaptured Matveyevka and pushed back the Ukrainian push towards Vedreno, which happened just a couple of days ago, and they've also managed to regain full control over Olgovka, here to the east of Koronevo. With this has completely secured the Koronevo direction, and it will likely be that the Ukrainians will withdraw further all the way back to the Lyubimovka Pokrovsk line here to the south. This means that the Russians will quickly capture the area of the forest areas here to the northwest of this line, and at the same time, with the push of the Russians towards Pokrovsk, they are already attacking the line of defense that the Ukrainians have with this village chain here to the southeast of Koronevo. Generally, what we see from the current Kursk counteroffensive of the Russians is that the Ukrainians have miscalculated the strength of the Russians and their ability to hold onto territory that is neither well fortified or when the Russians do not have the necessary strength. Therefore, we see that the Russians are having a successful counterattack, which is well executed based on the footage we are seeing, mainly due to Ukraine's lack of strength in this area, especially due to the rotation of forces from the Kursk direction to the Donetsk region. And this clearly shows why gambling is terrible, because the game of chicken has ended up in Russia's favor, and Ukraine is suffering significantly due to it. The Russians are posting constant footage of new captured POWs, and at the same time they're capturing heaps of territory. There is no clear evidence that they're taking a lot of casualties from this either, since every single one of the footage we've seen so far are FPV drones checking out the situation, and there's hardly any artillery, there's not enough mines, and the fortified positions are not well prepared due to the lack of time to prepare necessary defenses. Based on all of this, we see that the Russians are having a significant advantage here in the Kursk direction, following the Ukrainians backing out of the game of chicken and spreading out their forces to cover the entirety of the front line. All of this while the Russians simply have more soldiers and more equipment than what the Ukrainians have. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians have expanded slightly here to the southeast of Makiivka. They are looking to enter the southern parts of the town in the eastern bank of the Serbis River line. They're doing this with a combined strike from the east along the fields and forest line, and they'll also enter from the northern parts from the positions within Makiivka that they already hold. In the next section of the front line here in the direction of Donetsk, the Russians have advanced further within the central parts of the city, following the capture of the prison, which was a well-fortified defensive outpost of the Ukrainians here in the eastern parts of Donetsk. The Russians are now pushing further and deeper into Donetsk. Their objective seems to be the apartment complex area here in the central parts of the city. Gaining a foothold there will strengthen the Russian positions within the city of Donetsk and allow them to push down south to connect with the Russian foothold in the southern parts of the city and to cut off the Ukrainian presence within the forest area and the hill here in the eastern parts of Donetsk, which could collapse yet another line of defense of the Ukrainians in the direction of Donetsk section of the front line. And just south in the New York direction, the Russians are also pushing in a northern direction to the western parts of Nelipivka, where heavy fighting is taking place. The Ukrainians were here hoping to open the road between New York and Nelipivka here in the western parts, following the Russian counterattack in the eastern parts, which led to the recapture and reallocation of troops in the direction of Nelipivka, gaining a foothold there. The 12th Azov Brigade is continuously attempting to save the remaining soldiers of the Ukrainian side within the industrial zone. However, they are so far failing to do so. Following the Ukrainian allocation of reserves to the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians are struggling to advance further. There was this advance here to the west of Novhradivka, and there are reports that the Russians are storming Sukhy Yar and Sivka. However, generally, any further advances here in this direction would be very difficult for the Russians due to the arrival of new reserves. New reserves were needed to stabilize this section of the front line because the Ukrainians were running out of their uses for the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which had been fighting ever since it arrived back into Ukraine. It was finishing up some training, equipping their equipment and everything else in between. Then they were used for the Ukrainian summer offensive of 2023, and they have been non-stop fighting ever since, but they've been fighting in the Avdiivka section of the front line since the battle over Berdishi here in the east. This has led to a fighting withdrawal all the way to Pokrovsk, after which, due to heavy losses, they were sent to the rear. According to this Forbes article, the United States have sent 300 Bradley fighting vehicles just for the 47th Mechanized Brigade, and now they are sending additional ones. And during this period where they're going to be refitting with new equipment, they're also going to be needing additional manpower for the ones that they have lost during the fighting, and they need to rest for all of the fighting that they have done since the arrival into Ukraine. Therefore, the 47th Mechanized Brigade is currently out of the picture as it is getting refitted in the rear, and this has led to the Ukrainians being forced to send new reinforcements to the Pokrovsk section of the front line, which seems to be, according to militaryland.net, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade coming to replace them here a week ago. The 93rd Mechanized Brigade is a veteran brigade that was used during the Ukrainian Kharkiv counteroffensive in 2022, and in the Battle of Bakhmut during the Wagner presence there, and the Ukrainian summer offensive during 2023. Therefore, it has a lot of experience there. It is heavily reliant on Soviet equipment, but has also received CV-90s from Sweden. Further south in the direction of Ukrainsk, the Russians have expanded much more than they had yesterday, and this is due to the capture of the fortified positions just north of the town, which has led to the Ukrainians redirecting their defensive forces to the northern flank to secure the fortified positions, the coal mine here to the west of it, and this has led to a general redirection of forces from the eastern parts to the western parts, which has led to the Russian capture of the fortified positions southeast of the town and further advances within it in the eastern and central parts of it. Therefore, we see that the Ukrainian town of Ukrainsk is near collapse due to the Russian expansion in the northern parts, where the Russians will look to gain full control over the town itself and the fortified positions to the west of it. Just north of this, there's a small advance by the Russians here within the eastern parts of Belidove, where in the Dacha area the Russians are doing some street fighting against the Ukrainian Jaeger brigades. So we see that throughout the front line, the Russians continue their offensive operations, mainly in the Pokrovsk, section of the front line in the central parts of the Donetsk region, Vuhledar in the southern part, Turetsk and New York in the eastern parts, not to mention the Serbets River line in the north, as well as the Kupiansk section of the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.